In 1882, beneath the high prairie skies, a homesteader's lonely courtship ended with an empty cabin and a name whispered only by the wind. A promise made was a promise broken. 40 years later, a prospector's shovel, searching for quartz, struck a different kind of treasure buried in the unforgiving earth. A leather-bound diary, its brittle pages holding the final terrifying words of a bride who never was. Jedediah Stone leaned on his shovel, the midday sun beating down on the cracked leather of his hat. Before him stood the husk of a cabin, its timbers bleached to the color of bone by 40 years of prairie sun and wind. He'd stumbled upon it by chance, a lonely sentinel in a vast sea of grass, miles from any track he knew. The door hung agape on a single rusted hinge, a dark mouth yawning into the past. His bad leg throbbed, a familiar drumbeat of old regrets, as he limped toward the threshold, the silence of the place pressing in on him. He wasn't looking for ghosts, just a place to rest his weary bones for a spell, but the cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Inside, the air was thick with the dust of ages, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything in a uniform shade of gray. A simple plank table and a single chair stood in the center of the one-room dwelling, as if awaiting a guest who had been long delayed. Jed ran a calloused finger over the tabletop, leaving a clean streak in the grime. He imagined a man sitting here, a lonely homesteader staring out at the endless horizon, waiting for a woman he'd only known through letters. It was a familiar story out here on the plains, a gamble of the heart played out across 1,000 miles of wilderness. Sometimes the gamble paid off, and sometimes it seemed it didn't. A small, overturned crate in the corner drew his attention. He nudged it with the toe of his boot, revealing a scattering of objects beneath a tarnished silver thimble, a spool of faded blue thread, and a small leather-bound book of poetry, its cover warped by time and moisture. He picked up the book, its pages stiff and brittle. The inscription on the flyleaf was written in a delicate looping script. "To my dearest Eleanor, may these words bring you comfort until we are together at last. Yours, Thomas." The name hung in the still air, a whisper of a life interrupted. He wondered about Eleanor, about the hopes she must have carried with her to this desolate place. He wondered what had become of her, and of Thomas. He moved toward the hearth, a gaping maw of fieldstone and crumbling mortar. A rusted cookpot sat on the cold ashes, a silent testament to a meal never finished. Beside it, a small, hand-carved wooden bird lay on its side, its painted feathers chipped and faded. Jed picked it up, turning it over in his palm. It was a crude thing, but there was a certain tenderness in its carving, the work of a man trying to create a small piece of beauty in a harsh and unforgiving world. He imagined Thomas carving it by the firelight, a gift for his mail-order bride, a small token of a future that would never come to pass. The silence of the cabin seemed to deepen, no longer empty but filled with the weight of unanswered questions. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of a loneliness that was not his own, a ghostly echo of a long-ago sorrow. Jed spent the rest of the afternoon sifting through the meager remains of the life that had briefly inhabited this cabin. He found a broken comb, its teeth missing like a gap-toothed smile. He found a single small leather boot, its laces still tied, tucked away beneath the rough-hewn bunk as if its owner had intended to retrieve it at any moment. The boot was too small for a man, its shape delicate and worn. He held it in his hand, the leather cool against his skin, and for a moment he could almost feel the presence of the woman who had worn it, a fleeting, ghostly impression of a life cut short. He placed it carefully on the table, a solitary clue in a mystery 40 years cold. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the prairie, Jed knew he could not simply move on. The story of this place had taken root in him, a burr under the saddle of his own restless soul. He had come to this spot looking for gold, for the glint of color in the rock that promised a fleeting fortune. But he had found something else entirely, something that spoke to a deeper, more profound kind of poverty, the poverty of a life unlived, of a love lost to the silence of the plains. He would make his camp here tonight, under the same vast, star-dusted sky that had once watched over Thomas and Eleanor. He would stay not for the lure of gold, but for the pull of a story that demanded an ending. He owed it to them. He owed it to himself. The next morning, Jed awoke with the sun, the cool prairie air a balm on his weathered skin. The cabin stood silent, its secrets still locked within its decaying walls. After a meager breakfast of dried jerky and hardtack, he set out to retrace what he imagined to be Eleanor's final steps. He started at the cabin, his eyes scanning the ground for any sign, any trace of her passing. But the wind and the rain of 40 years had wiped the slate clean. There were no footprints, no broken twigs, no tangible evidence of a woman's flight or struggle. There was only the endless waving grass, the vast, indifferent sky, and the oppressive silence of the plains. He walked in an ever-widening circle around the homestead, his gaze fixed on the ground. He was a prospector by trade, his eyes trained to spot the subtle variations in the earth, the telltale signs of a hidden vein of ore. Now, he applied that same meticulous attention to the search for a different kind of treasure, a clue to a woman's fate. He noted the way the land sloped gently downward to the east, toward a shallow, winding creek bed, its bottom now dry and cracked. He imagined Eleanor walking this way, perhaps to fetch water, or perhaps simply to escape the confines of the small cabin, to find a moment of solitude in the immense emptiness of her new home. He followed the creek bed for more than a mile, the sun climbing higher in the sky, beating down on his back. The silence was broken only by the buzz of insects and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. He saw nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest a struggle or a sudden violent end. And yet the feeling of wrongness persisted, a low, constant hum beneath the surface of the day. He thought of Clara, of the way she had looked at him when he'd told her he was leaving again, her eyes a mixture of love and resignation. He had promised to return, a promise he had fully intended to keep, but the lure of the next strike, the next horizon, had been too strong. He had vanished from her life as completely as Eleanor had vanished from this place. By midday he had found nothing. He stopped to rest in the shade of a solitary, stunted cottonwood tree, its leaves rustling in the hot wind. He took a long drink from his canteen, the water warm and tasting of metal. He looked back at the cabin, a tiny, insignificant speck in the distance. It was easy to imagine someone simply walking away from it, disappearing into the vastness of the landscape. But Eleanor had not been a restless prospector like himself. She had been a bride, a woman who had traveled 1,000 miles to build a new life in this place. She would not have simply walked away. Something had happened here, something terrible. He spent the afternoon casting further afield, his limp becoming more pronounced as the day wore on. He explored a series of low, rocky outcroppings to the north of the cabin, their surfaces covered in a patchwork of lichen and moss. He ran his hands over the rough, weathered stone, searching for any sign, any scratch or mark that might tell a story. He found the faded remnants of an old campfire, the stones of its ring scattered and half buried in the earth. But there was no way of knowing who had built it, or when. It was just another dead end, another silent witness to the passage of time. As the shadows began to lengthen once more, a sense of frustration and weariness settled over him. The prairie was a vast and unforgiving place, a place that swallowed secrets whole. He had been a fool to think he could uncover a truth that had been buried for 4 decades. He was a prospector, not a detective. His skills were in reading the land for signs of gold, not for signs of a long-ago tragedy. He was about to turn back, to abandon his quest and move on, when something caught his eye. It was a small, unnatural shape in the distance, a glint of white against the dun-colored earth. It was a long shot, but it was the only one he had. He turned and began to walk toward it, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm in his chest. The glint of white turned out to be a large outcrop of quartz, a jagged spine of rock thrusting up from the prairie floor. It was the kind of formation that would excite any prospector, a promising sign of potential gold deposits. But Jed's attention was not on the rock itself. It was on the ground at its base, where the earth seemed to be slightly disturbed, a shallow depression that was almost imperceptible to the casual observer. But Jed's eyes were not casual. He saw the subtle difference in the color and texture of the soil, the way the grass grew in a slightly different pattern. Something had been buried here. He took his shovel from his shoulder, the worn hickory of its handle familiar and reassuring in his hands. He began to dig, the blade of the shovel scraping against the dry, sun-baked earth. The work was slow and arduous, the ground hard and compacted. With each shovelful of dirt he removed, his sense of anticipation grew. He didn't know what he was looking for, what he expected to find. But he knew, with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason, that this was the place. This was where the prairie held its secret. After nearly an hour of digging, the shovel struck something hard with a dull, resonant thud. It was not the sharp, metallic ring of rock. It was something else, something softer, more yielding. He knelt down, his bad leg protesting, and began to clear away the remaining soil with his hands. The earth was cool and damp beneath the surface, and it smelled of decay and time. His fingers brushed against a rough, textured surface. It was leather. He worked carefully now, his breath held tight in his chest. He cleared away the dirt, revealing the corner of a book, its leather cover stained and molded, its pages swollen and warped by years of burial. It was a diary. He lifted it from its shallow grave, the book surprisingly heavy in his hands. The leather was cold and clammy, and a faint, acrid smell rose from its pages, the smell of old secrets and slow decay. The binding was held together by a single tarnished brass clasp, which he gently unfastened. He opened the book, his heart pounding. The pages were brittle and yellowed, the ink faded to a pale, ghostly brown. The script was the same delicate, looping hand he had seen in the book of poetry in the cabin. Eleanor. The first few entries were filled with the hopes and anxieties of a young woman on the brink of a new life. She wrote of her long journey west, of her dreams of a home and a family, of her apprehension about meeting the man she had only known through his letters. She described her arrival at the cabin, her first impressions of the vast, empty prairie, and her growing affection for Thomas, the quiet, gentle man who had brought her here. Jed sat there on the hard ground, the setting sun casting a warm, golden light over the endless plains, and he read. He read of their simple shared life in the small cabin, of the small joys and the daily struggles of homesteading. He read of the wild beauty of the prairie, of the fierce storms that swept across the plains, of the profound and sometimes terrifying silence of the wilderness. He read of their plans for the future, of the children they hoped to have, of the life they planned to build together in this wild, untamed land. The words on the page brought Eleanor to life, transforming her from a ghostly, half-forgotten name into a living, breathing woman, full of hope and love and fear. He read until the light began to fail, the words on the page becoming difficult to decipher in the fading twilight. He came to the final entry, dated just a few weeks after her arrival. The tone of the writing had changed. The hope and optimism were gone, replaced by a palpable sense of fear and desperation. The last few lines were a frantic, barely legible scrawl, the words blurring together as if written in a great hurry or in a state of extreme agitation. He had to squint to make them out, his blood running cold as he read the final, chilling words. He is not who he seems. I am not safe here. If I am not heard from again, know that it was not the prairie that took me. The next day, Jed rode into the small, dusty town of Redemption, the diary wrapped carefully in an oilcloth and tucked into his saddlebag. Redemption was little more than a wide spot in the road, a collection of false-fronted buildings huddled together as if for protection against the vast, empty prairie that surrounded it. A trading post, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a handful of houses were all that it consisted of. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where secrets were a valuable currency, and where outsiders were viewed with suspicion. He hitched his horse in front of the trading post, the only establishment that seemed to show any signs of life. The interior was dark and cool, the air thick with the smells of leather, tobacco, and dust. A portly, balding man with a handlebar mustache and a stained apron stood behind the counter, polishing a glass with a dirty rag. He looked up as Jed entered, his eyes narrowed in a shrewd, calculating gaze. "What can I do for you, stranger?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Jed leaned against the counter, trying to appear casual. "I'm a prospector," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "Been working a claim a few days' ride from here. Stumbled upon an old, abandoned homestead. Belonged to a fellow named Thomas, I believe, and his wife, Eleanor. He watched the man's face carefully for any flicker of recognition, any sign that the names meant something to him. But the man's expression remained impassive, his eyes as hard and opaque as river stones. "Never heard of them," the man said, turning his attention back to the glass he was polishing. "Lot of folks come and go out here. Most of them don't last." "This was a long time ago," Jed pressed on. 40 years or so. "The woman Eleanor, she disappeared, vanished without a trace." The man shrugged, a gesture of studied indifference. "The prairie has a way of swallowing people up," he said. "It's a hard land. Not everyone is cut out for it." Jed knew he was being stonewalled. The man's denial was too quick, too complete. He decided to try a different approach. He pulled the small, hand-carved wooden bird from his pocket and placed it on the counter. "I found this in the cabin," he said. "Thought it might have some value to someone." The man glanced at the bird, his eyes lingering on it for a fraction of a second too long. For the briefest of moments, Jed saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a ghost of a memory, a hint of a long-buried emotion. But then it was gone, replaced by the same mask of indifference. "It's a crude thing," the man said, pushing the bird back toward Jed with a dismissive flick of his wrist. Jed left the trading post with a growing sense of unease. The man knew something. He was sure of it. He spent the rest of the day in Redemption, asking questions, trying to pry open the closed doors of the town's memory. But everywhere he went, he was met with the same wall of silence, the same suspicious glances, the same vague, evasive answers. The people of Redemption were guarding a secret they had kept for 40 years, and they were not about to share it with a stranger. As evening approached, Jed found himself in the town's only saloon, a dingy, smoke-filled room with a long, scarred bar and a handful of sullen, silent patrons. He ordered a whiskey, the fiery liquid doing little to warm the chill that had settled deep in his bones. He sat at a small table in the corner, nursing his drink, watching the faces of the men around him. They were hard men, their faces etched with the hardships of a life lived on the frontier. They were men who knew how to keep a secret. He was about to give up, to admit defeat and ride out of town, when an old man, his face a road map of wrinkles, shuffled over to his table. He was a frail, stooped figure, his eyes a pale, watery blue. He leaned in close to Jed, his voice a hoarse, conspiratorial whisper. "You're asking about the woman who disappeared," he said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. "You're wasting your time. No one in this town will talk to you about her." "Why not?" Jed asked, his heart quickening. The old man glanced around the room, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. "Because some things are better left buried," he said, his voice barely audible above the low murmur of the saloon. "For everyone's sake." He then turned and shuffled away, disappearing into the smoky gloom, leaving Jed alone with his whiskey and his unanswered questions. Back in the relative solitude of his camp, miles from the tight-lipped town of Redemption, Jed rekindled his fire and settled down with the diary. The old man's words had only deepened his resolve. Some things are better left buried, not for him, not when he held the key to that burial in his own 2 hands. The flickering firelight cast dancing shadows across the brittle pages as he turned back to the final frantic entry. He read it again and again, trying to wrest some new meaning from the faded ink, some clue he had missed in his initial, hurried reading. "He is not who he seems." The words echoed in his mind, a stark and chilling warning. Thomas, the quiet, gentle homesteader, the man who had carved the small wooden bird, was not what he had appeared to be. He decided to start from the beginning, to read the diary not as a historical document, but as a map, a guide to the landscape of Eleanor's mind in her final days. He read of her initial impressions of Thomas, of his kindness, his attentiveness, his almost overwhelming desire to please her. At first, she had found it endearing, a welcome contrast to the rough, unrefined men she had known back east. But as the days turned into weeks, a subtle, disquieting undercurrent began to emerge in her writing. She wrote of his strange moods, of the way he would sometimes fall into a deep, brooding silence, his eyes distant and clouded with some secret sorrow. She wrote of his possessiveness, of the way he would watch her constantly, his gaze a weight upon her, a constant, unnerving pressure. The diary was not just a record of events, it was a testament to a growing, creeping dread. Eleanor's initial optimism slowly, inexorably gave way to a gnawing anxiety. She felt trapped, isolated, 1,000 miles from anyone she knew, completely dependent on a man she was beginning to realize she did not know at all. He had lied to her in his letters, not about his land or his prospects, but about himself, about the darkness he carried within him. Jed felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his stomach. He had seen that kind of darkness in the eyes of men in the mining camps, a brittle, explosive mixture of loneliness and desperation that could curdle into violence with little warning. Then he found it. Tucked away in the middle of the diary, in a section she had written just days before her final entry, was the first shocking confession, the first major twist in the story. She described a night when Thomas, in a drunken maudlin fit, had confessed to her the reason for his overwhelming melancholy, the source of the secret sorrow that haunted him. He had been married before. His first wife had died a few years earlier, not from illness or accident, but by her own hand. She had hanged herself from the rafters of the very cabin in which Eleanor now lived. Thomas, in his desperate loneliness, had omitted this crucial detail from his letters. He had brought his new bride to a house of ghosts, a place tainted by a past tragedy he had tried to erase. The revelation hit Jed like a physical blow. He stared at the words on the page, the delicate script belying the horror of the story they told. He now understood the source of Eleanor's growing fear, the reason for her palpable sense of unease. She was not just living with a stranger, she was living in a tomb, a place where a woman much like herself had been driven to despair. The cabin was not a home, it was a prison, and Thomas was not a gentle homesteader. He was a haunted, broken man, a man whose grief had festered into something dark and possessive. He had not been looking for a wife. He had been looking for a replacement, a ghost to fill the void left by another ghost. Jed closed the diary, his hands trembling slightly. The mystery of Eleanor's disappearance had just taken a much darker, more sinister turn. It was no longer a simple case of a woman vanishing on the prairie. It was a story of deception, of a terrible, tragic secret, and of a woman trapped in a house of sorrow with a man on the edge of madness. He looked out at the vast, dark prairie, the silence no longer peaceful but menacing, filled with the echoes of a long-ago scream. He knew now that Eleanor had not simply run away. She had been trying to escape, and he was beginning to fear that she had not been successful. He had unearthed her diary. Now he had to unearth the rest of the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers. The prairie night, a vast, silent dome of stars. Jed sat hunched over the diary, the lamplight casting a small, warm circle in the immense darkness. The revelation of Thomas's first wife had shaken him, but it didn't feel like the whole story. It was a piece of the puzzle, a significant one, but there were still too many gaps, too many unanswered questions. Eleanor's final, terrified entry still haunted him. He is not who he seems. Was the deception simply the omission of his first wife's suicide? Or was there something more, something even darker that she had discovered in her final days? He ran a hand over his tired, gritty eyes, the words on the page starting to blur. He was about to close the book for the night when his thumb brushed against a page near the back, a page that felt different from the others. It was stiffer, thicker, as if two pages had been stuck together. He held it up to the lamplight. His curiosity piqued. He could see a faint, dark line along the edge. Using the tip of his knife, he carefully worked at the corner, trying to separate the pages without tearing them. They had been glued together with a crude, homemade paste, a deliberate act of concealment. After several long, tense minutes, he managed to pry the pages apart. The inner surfaces were covered in writing, a different kind of writing from the rest of the diary. It was not ink, but a faint, brownish stain, as if written with some kind of homemade pigment. And the script was not Eleanor's delicate, looping hand. It was a smaller, more cramped, more urgent script, a secret message hidden within the pages of her public diary. It was a second, invisible entry, a desperate attempt to record a truth too dangerous to write in plain sight. He had to hold the page at an angle to the light, his eyes straining to decipher the faint, spidery words. The invisible ink, whatever it was, had faded over time, but it was still legible, just barely. As he read, a cold, creeping horror washed over him, a horror far greater than anything he had felt before. This was not Eleanor's voice. It was the voice of a different woman, the first wife. Her name was Sarah. Sarah had not committed suicide. She had been murdered. The hidden entry was a last, desperate testament, a message from beyond the grave. Sarah had written it in the days leading up to her death, sensing that her life was in danger. She described Thomas not as a grieving, broken man, but as a cruel and violent one, a man given to fits of rage and jealousy. He had controlled her every move, isolated her from her family and friends, and subjected her to a campaign of psychological terror that had left her a prisoner in her own home. She had tried to leave him once, but he had tracked her down and dragged her back, promising her that she would never escape him. She knew he was going to kill her. She had written this hidden message, using a pigment she had made from berries and rust, hoping that one day someone would find it, that someone would know the truth of what had happened to her. Jed's blood ran cold. He felt as if he had been punched in the gut. The story was not what he thought it was. It was so much worse. Thomas was not a haunted man. He was a monster, a murderer who had killed his first wife, and then, a few years later, had lured another unsuspecting woman to his isolated prairie home. And now Jed knew with a terrible, chilling certainty what had happened to Eleanor. She had not just discovered the secret of Sarah's suicide. She had discovered the truth. She had likely found the hidden entry, just as he had, and in doing so she had signed her own death warrant. He looked at the diary, this small, tattered book that he had pulled from the earth. It was no longer just the story of a vanished mail-order bride. It was a testament to 2 murders, a silent accusation that had been waiting for 40 years to be heard. He thought of the man in the trading post, of his flat, dead eyes and his dismissive denial. He thought of the old man in the saloon, of his whispered warning. Some things are better left buried. They had not been protecting the memory of a grieving widower. They had been protecting a murderer. The whole town was in on it. The whole town was complicit in the silence that had allowed a killer to walk free. Jed felt a surge of cold, hard rage. He was no longer just a prospector, an amateur detective. He was an avenger. He would not let this stand. He would bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. The dawn broke cold and gray, the prairie sky the color of old pewter. Jed had not slept. He had spent the night staring into the dying embers of his fire. The words of Sarah's hidden message burned into his brain. He was no longer just piecing together a story. He was untangling a conspiracy, a web of deceit that had been woven 40 years ago and had held fast ever since. The complicity of the town of Redemption was the key. They had known, they had all known, and they had chosen to remain silent. The question was why? What could possibly motivate an entire community to protect a man like Thomas? He turned back to the diary, his eyes gritty with exhaustion. He had to assume that Eleanor, after discovering Sarah's hidden message, had tried to escape. Her final, frantic entry was a testament to that. "I am not safe here." She had known that Thomas would kill her, just as he had killed Sarah. She must have fled the cabin, run out into the vast, empty prairie, hoping to find safety, to find someone who would believe her. And that was where the trail went cold. That was where the web of deceit had been spun. He began to read Eleanor's diary again, this time with a new, terrible understanding. He was no longer just looking for clues about her state of mind. He was looking for names, for connections, for anyone she might have mentioned who could have been a part of the conspiracy. He read of her trip to the trading post in Redemption, her one and only visit to the town. She described the owner, a man named Henderson, the same portly, mustachioed man Jed had spoken to, only 40 years younger. She wrote that Henderson had been strangely solicitous, almost fawning, but that his eyes were cold and watchful. Then he found the entry that made his blood freeze. It was a seemingly innocent passage, written about a week before her disappearance. She wrote of a visit to the cabin by another homesteader, a neighbor from a few miles away. His name was Jebediah Hayes, a man who had offered to help Thomas with his spring planting. She described him as a kind, soft-spoken man, a widower with a young son. He had brought them a loaf of freshly baked bread and had spent the afternoon talking with Thomas about crops and cattle. Eleanor had been grateful for the company, for the brief respite from the oppressive solitude of the cabin. But there was one detail she mentioned that now, in the cold light of this new day, seemed sinister and foreboding. Jebediah Hayes was Thomas's brother. Jed stared at the name, a cold, sickening realization dawning on him. The old man in the saloon, the frail, stooped figure with the watery blue eyes who had warned him to leave things buried. He had not given his name, but Jed knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had been speaking to Jebediah Hayes, Thomas's brother. The kind, soft-spoken neighbor who had brought Eleanor a loaf of bread was a part of the conspiracy. He had not been a friend. He had been a watchdog, a guardian of his brother's dark secret. The web was becoming clearer now, its threads more visible. Thomas had not acted alone. He had an accomplice, a brother who had helped him maintain his facade, who had helped him lure Eleanor into his trap, and it was likely Jebediah who had helped him cover up the murder. It explained the silence of the town. The Hayes brothers were a family, and in a small, isolated community like Redemption, family ties were everything. To accuse one brother was to accuse the other, and to go against a family like that, a family that had been there for generations, was to invite trouble, to risk being ostracized. Or worse, the town had not been protecting a murderer out of malice. They had been protecting themselves, out of fear. Jed now understood the depth of the deception, the layers of lies that had been built up over 40 years. It was not just one man's secret. It was a town's secret, a conspiracy of silence that had allowed a killer to live out his days in peace, while two women lay in unmarked graves. He thought of Jebediah Hayes, of his frailness, his age. He was an old man now, living with the weight of his brother's sins. But he was not too old to be held accountable. He was not too old to be made to speak the truth. Jed packed up his camp with a grim, determined sense of purpose. He was no longer just seeking justice for Eleanor and Sarah. He was seeking to unravel a legacy of lies that had poisoned an entire community. He would return to Redemption not to ask questions, but to provide answers. He would confront Jebediah Hayes. He would force him to look him in the eye and admit what he had done, what he had helped his brother to do. The ghosts of the prairie were screaming, and he would not rest until their voices were heard. The ride back to Redemption was a grim pilgrimage. The sky was a vast, unforgiving gray, the wind a low, mournful moan across the plains. Jed felt as if he were carrying the weight of 40 years of silence in his saddlebags, the tattered diary a heavy, accusing presence. He no longer saw the prairie as a place of beauty or solitude, but as a vast, unmarked graveyard, a place that held its secrets close. He knew that confronting Jebediah Hayes would not be easy. He was not just confronting a man, he was confronting a town, a history, a way of life built on a foundation of lies. He found Hayes not in the saloon, but in a small, weathered clapboard house at the edge of town, a place that seemed to be slowly surrendering to the encroaching prairie. A thin plume of smoke rose from its stone chimney, a fragile sign of life against the bleak landscape. Jed dismounted, his bad leg aching with a dull, insistent throb. He walked up the short, weed-choked path to the front door and knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the profound silence. After a long moment, the door creaked open, and Jebediah Hayes stood before him, a stooped, frail figure silhouetted against the dim light of the house. His watery blue eyes widened in recognition, and for a fleeting second, Jed saw a flash of pure, undiluted fear in them. The old man tried to slam the door, but Jed was too quick for him. He put his shoulder to the wood and pushed, forcing his way into the small, cluttered room. "We need to talk," Jed said, his voice low and hard. "I have nothing to say to you," Hayes whispered, his voice trembling. He backed away from Jed, his hands raised as if to ward off a blow. "I know who you are," Jed said, his gaze unwavering. "I know you're Thomas's brother, and I know what you did. I know you helped him." Hayes shook his head, a gesture of frantic denial. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "My brother was a good man, a grieving man. He wouldn't have hurt anyone." "Wouldn't he?" Jed said, his voice dripping with contempt. He reached into his coat and pulled out the diary, holding it up for the old man to see. "I found this," he said. "I found Eleanor's diary, and I found what Sarah wrote. I know that Thomas murdered her, and I know that he murdered Eleanor when she found out the truth." The color drained from Hayes's face. He stared at the diary as if it were a venomous snake, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He sank into a nearby chair, his frail body trembling uncontrollably. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by the crushing weight of a secret he had carried for 4 decades. "You were there, weren't you?" Jed pressed on, his voice relentless. "You were there the day Eleanor disappeared. She ran from the cabin, didn't she? She ran for her life, and she came to you for help. She trusted you, and you betrayed her. You took her back to your brother. You let him kill her." Tears began to stream down the old man's wrinkled cheeks, silent, desperate tears of a man whose soul had been eroded by a lifetime of guilt.
He nodded.
A small, almost imperceptible movement of his head. "He was my brother," he whispered, his voice choked with a grief that was 40 years old. "He was my blood." The story came tumbling out then, a torrent of confession that had been dammed up for a lifetime. He told Jed how Eleanor had come running to his house, her face wild with terror, clutching the diary in her hands. She had shown him Sarah's hidden message, and he had seen the truth in her eyes, the same terrible truth he had suspected, but had refused to acknowledge for years. But the bonds of family, the twisted, unyielding loyalty of blood, had been stronger than his conscience. He had calmed her down, promised to help her, and then he had sent his son to fetch Thomas. He had held her there, a prisoner in his own home, until his brother arrived. He had watched as Thomas dragged her away, her screams echoing across the prairie until they were swallowed by the vast, indifferent silence. He had not seen the murder, but he had heard it, and he had done nothing. "Where is she?" Jed demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "Where did he bury her?" Hayes looked up at him, his eyes filled with a bottomless despair. "He buried her out on the plains," he whispered, "by the quartz outcrop. He said it was the only beautiful thing in this whole God-forsaken land. He said she deserved to rest by something beautiful." The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Jed had not just found Eleanor's diary, he had been digging on her grave. The realization was a cold, hard knot in the pit of his stomach. He had been so close to the truth all along, separated from it by only a few feet of sun-baked earth. He looked at the old, broken man cowering in the chair before him, and he felt not pity but a cold, hard contempt. This man was not just a silent accomplice. He was a monster in his own right, a man who had sacrificed an innocent woman on the altar of family loyalty. He had let his brother commit murder, not once but twice, and he had lived with that secret, that sin, for 40 years. The time for secrets was over. The time for reckoning had come. The confession of Jebediah Hayes was a lit fuse, and it burned its way through the heart of redemption with astonishing speed. Jed did not have to spread the word. Hayes, unburdened of his secret for the first time in 4 decades, seemed to crumble under the weight of his own guilt. He stumbled out of his house and into the dusty main street of the town, his whispered, frantic confessions drawing a small, bewildered crowd. The truth, once released, could not be contained. It flowed through the town like a prairie fire, consuming the carefully constructed facade of denial and silence that had stood for a generation. The first to demand justice were the descendants of Sarah's family, a clan of tough, hard-bitten ranchers who had always harbored suspicions about her suicide. They had been stonewalled by the town, their questions met with a wall of silence, but they had never forgotten. They rode into redemption with grim, set faces, their eyes burning with a cold, righteous anger. They were followed by the distant relatives of Eleanor, a family that had long ago given her up for dead, another victim of the harsh frontier. They had not known the details of her disappearance, only that she had vanished without a trace. Now the horrific truth of her fate had been resurrected, and they demanded a reckoning. The town of redemption was torn apart. Families that had lived side by side for generations were now pitted against each other, the old bonds of community shattered by the revelation of the long-buried secret. The descendants of the men who had known the truth, who had chosen to remain silent out of fear or misplaced loyalty, were now forced to confront the legacy of their father's sins. Accusations and recriminations flew like dust in a windstorm. The trading post, owned by the son of the man who had first met Eleanor, was boycotted. The Henderson family, once respected pillars of the community, were now pariahs, their names synonymous with deceit and cowardice. Jed stood on the periphery of the storm, a quiet, haunted observer. He had set this in motion, but it had taken on a life of its own, a force of nature that was as unstoppable as a prairie blizzard. He had wanted justice for Eleanor and Sarah, but he had not anticipated the sheer, destructive force of the truth. He saw the pain and the anger in the faces of the people around him, and he wondered if he had done the right thing. Was it better to let the dead lie, to let the past remain buried, or to unearth it no matter the cost? He led the townspeople out to the quartz outcrop, the place where he had found the diary, the place where Eleanor had been buried. They brought shovels, and they began to dig, their movements grim and determined. It did not take them long to find her. Her skeletal remains were wrapped in a decaying oilcloth, her bones brittle and stained by the earth. Beside her lay the remains of another body, a man's body. It was Thomas. After burying Eleanor, he had returned to the spot and taken his own life, a final selfish act of a man who could not live with what he had done, but who had refused to face the consequences of his actions in this life. The second major twist in the story was not one of conspiracy, but of a final desperate act of a guilty man. He had not lived out his days in peace, as Jebediah had claimed. He had chosen to join his victims in the cold, silent earth. The discovery of the two bodies brought a new, somber reality to the unfolding drama. The anger and the desire for vengeance were still there, but they were now tempered by a profound and all-encompassing sorrow. The town of Redemption had not just been complicit in a murder, they had been complicit in a tragedy that had consumed an entire family, a tragedy whose roots went deeper than anyone had imagined. The web of deceit had been woven not just to protect a killer, but to hide a wound so deep and so terrible that the town had chosen to pretend it didn't exist. A makeshift funeral was held on the prairie, under the vast, indifferent sky. The remains of Eleanor and Sarah, whose own unmarked grave was finally located on the old Hayes homestead, were buried side by side in the town's small, windswept cemetery. The people of Redemption stood together, their faces a mixture of grief, shame, and a dawning, fragile sense of resolution. The secrets had been unearthed. The ghosts had been laid to rest. The reckoning was over, but the ruin it had left in its wake would take a long, long time to heal. In the days that followed, the town of Redemption slowly began to pick up the pieces of its shattered identity. The anger and recriminations gave way to a quiet, collective grief, a shared understanding of the terrible price of silence. Jebediah Hayes, a broken and pathetic figure, was not prosecuted. His confession and the discovery of his brother's suicide had rendered a trial unnecessary. His punishment was to live out the rest of his days in the town he had helped to poison, a living monument to a legacy of deceit and cowardice. He was a ghost among the living, a constant reminder of the darkness that lay just beneath the surface of their quiet frontier lives. Jedediah Stone prepared to leave. His work here was done. He had come to this place in search of gold, but he had found something far more valuable and far more costly. He had unearthed a story that had needed to be told, a truth that had demanded to be heard. He had given a voice to the silent, and in doing so he had found a small measure of peace for his own restless soul. He had not been able to right the wrongs of his own past, to reclaim the love he had lost, but he had brought a measure of justice to two women who had been denied it for far too long. It was not a cure for his own regrets, but it was a balm. On the morning of his departure, he rode out to the small cemetery at the edge of town. He stood before the two fresh graves, two simple wooden crosses marking the final resting places of Eleanor and Sarah. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, a low, mournful sigh. He thought of these two women, of their hopes and their dreams, of the terrible, violent end they had met in this harsh and unforgiving land. He thought of Thomas and Jebediah, of the twisted bonds of family that had led to so much sorrow and ruin. He thought of the town of Redemption, of the long, difficult road it had ahead of it as it tried to heal the wounds of the past. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the small, hand-carved wooden bird he had found in the cabin. He had kept it all this time, a small, tangible link to the story that had consumed him. He knelt down and placed the bird on the fresh earth of Eleanor's grave, a final, small token of remembrance. It was a crude thing, but it was a symbol of a love that had once been real, however twisted and dark it had become. It was a reminder that even in the midst of the greatest darkness, there could be moments of beauty, however fleeting. As he rode away from redemption, he did not look back. He set his face to the west, toward the distant hazy mountains, toward the promise of a new horizon. The prairie stretched out before him, vast and empty, but it no longer seemed silent to him. It was filled with echoes, with the whispers of stories, with the ghosts of lives lived and lost. He knew that he would carry the story of Eleanor and Sarah with him for the rest of his days, a reminder of the fragility of life, the corrosive power of secrets, and the enduring, unyielding demand for truth. He was still a prospector, a searcher, but he knew now that the richest veins of gold are not always found in the earth. Sometimes they are found in the tattered pages of a forgotten diary, in the resurrected voices of the long dead, in the quiet and terrible and beautiful echoes across the plains.